So welcome. I'm talking about responsive web design today. And my name is Joseph Lebrec. I'm a senior interactive software engineer for the university. And I've got a number of other roles. I'm a principal and sole proprietor of Fractured Vision Media up in Thornton. And I also do a number of things for Adobe and for Apache. And I've got a number of authorships through lynda.com and Pluralsight, Peachpit, Apress, and so forth. So most of what I write about is web-based stuff, but it does vary a bit. So I thought we'd start talking about some basics of responsive web design. I don't assume that anybody here knows, the nuts and bolts of it or what we mean when we talk about responsive web design. So I'm going to start there and then sort of proceed with different fragments of how I see responsive web design today. So responsive web design itself, you can see I have a little quote here from Wikipedia, and it's pretty straightforward, just the approach aimed at allowing web pages to basically adapt to whatever screen they're on, right? And the important points to go with this, probably the three main ones involve CSS media queries, and we'll have a look at those in a little bit, fluid grids, and also flexible media. So when we say fluid grids, what we basically mean is grids that actually adapt to the size of the screen. If they work with media queries, the media queries can say like how those grids are laid out or how much space they take up and things like that. And flexible media is going to be like images and iframe embeds and content like that, which can be sized appropriately for different screens and different container elements and so forth in a web page. So here's a good example, a simple example of a media query. Media queries came about in CSS3, and it allows the content that's being rendered to have different rules applied to it depending upon things like what you see on the side here, different media features. The width, the height, aspect ratio, different color properties reported by the browser, the resolution, and so forth. So there's all sorts of things you can actually react to and change the layout or even the styling of different elements on the page based on this. So this little example CSS that I have here is a media query which is checking for max width of 600. And in that case, if we apply this hidden small class to an element, we set display none to that on those screens, and then it won't display at all, right? So you can use any sort of stuff. You can override all your different classes that you have for your base CSS with a number of different media queries. Different CSS layout methods. Most people years ago, the primary layout method was to create like a giant table and then slice up images and throw them in there, or use like spacer GIFs or things like that to sort of prop open the different cells and tables so that everything would look pixel perfect across the screen. And at that time, of course, we were only really worrying about a couple of screen sizes, the primary being probably 1024 by 768, and then there was like a couple more up and down, but it wasn't really something you had to worry about. Over the past 10, 15 years, different screen sizes, different resolutions, different devices, we've got a lot to worry about now. So we've had a number of additional things come into play. One of those is liquid layout, sometimes called fluid layout, and that's the idea that you would be able to set up different elements on your page with widths being in percentage. So if you had a header that should always be, say, 90% of the body, you could do that, and it's always got some margins on the side and so forth. However, the problems with that is that on a device, especially in portrait mode, if you've got like a couple columns of text, they all just get squished up and they become very thin and basically unreadable. You've just got text wrapping everywhere. There's something else that came about during that time that you can use with liquid layout, and I'm going to say too that all of these different layout methods can be used together. You can use a little of this, a little of that, and most people do, most models do. CSS floats and positioning. So this was a way to get away from that table layout architecture that I mentioned. You would be able to do things with float and margin, which are different CSS properties, and also positioning for like absolute positioning and relative positioning. And there were a lot of neat tricks you could do to, do some things that were fairly within your control when trying to lay stuff out. Of course, you've got a number of different browsers that people use, and those browsers all interpret certain things differently. And this has been a struggle since the beginning of web layout. So, and today it's not really that much better. It's supposed to be better, but it's really not. There's always stuff that I run into all the time where it's like, oh, Firefox does it this way, okay. And it's a big problem still. Moving on, we've got CSS Flexbox layout. And this is fairly new. It's only a few years old. And the primary drawback to Flexbox is that people get easily confused by Flexbox. And I think it's a very confusing model as well. It's a newer model. It's something that a lot of people are starting to just now adopt. Like Bootstrap 4, there's an option to use Flexbox instead of just using the regular grid stuff. And then you've got the CSS grid layout, which is something that people are kind of just starting to write about, just starting to talk about. It's the newest type of layout, and this image on the side here actually is derived from this new layout model. So using this model, you have a lot of control over things, but it's still a little confusing, and it is so new that not many people really know how to use it yet. In all honesty, I believe that most people are still using CSS floats and positioning for the majority of their web layout work. So those are the nuts and bolts. We also have responsive frameworks that sort of distance someone from that. And this is something that a lot of people find more desirable than writing their own entire layout just using media queries and positioning layouts and stuff. So we've got two main responsive frameworks. There's a ton of them out there, but right now Twitter Bootstrap is probably the #1 most used responsive framework. You can either use Bootstrap 3, which is the stable version, or Bootstrap 4, which is in alpha. And it's been in alpha for over a year, and I've used it successfully across a number of different projects that are actually in production right now, and it's fine. So, if you're considering Bootstrap 3 or 4, I'd say go with 4, just with the understanding that things might change in the future. And I understand they're very close to a beta version, in which case things really shouldn't change that much. It should be just bug fixes from there on. You've also got Zerb Foundation, and I've toyed with Foundation a little bit, but I didn't find it as friendly to use as Twitter Bootstrap was. In most of my work, I've kind of settled on Twitter Bootstrap to be kind of the responsive framework that I go to. And one of the nice things about it is that you don't have to use the whole framework if you don't want to. You can use little pieces of it. So if you just want to use the grid, you can just use the grid. It also comes with a bunch of different components and modules and things that you can use as well. But you don't really have to use any of that stuff if you don't want to. So one of the aspects that I find most interesting about working with this stuff, beyond the basics, beyond the frameworks, is the creative tooling aspect. Because if your tooling is no good, then it's going to be kind of a pain to deal with. I've always been interested in tooling. I'm not somebody who relies on the tooling for every single thing, but I'm also not the type of person who just wants to, start from scratch every time either. And I think having a good overview of the different options available can help people decide exactly what they want to pick and choose from. So yeah, sometimes I use Bootstrap and I override the media queries with my own media queries, and that's absolutely fine to do. And sometimes I use tooling for things. The IDE I use the most for writing code is IntelliJ IDEA, but I also use Visual Studio Code, I use brackets, and I use Dreamweaver from time to time. It all depends on what exactly I'm doing. But web browsers themselves have a number of robust tools built in that lets you do things like test exactly how things are working across various resolutions, various devices, and so forth. This is a picture of Google Chrome here, and you can see up top those colored bars are actually representative of the media queries on this particular page. This is the DU Portfolio project, and it's something that we at OTL are responsible for at the university, and this is actually written with Bootstrap 4, and we use all of the different column layouts and stuff like that, and we're using the media query aspect of it as well, as you can see there. But these tools allow you to just open up a web page, bring up the different tooling, and you can actually change either the CSS or actually change the nodal elements in there to experiment with things. So it's like, all right, this doesn't look quite right. Maybe if I tweak the CSS inside the dev tools, I'll get a better idea of what I need to do in the actual source code to fix this and then push it out later. So has anybody ever heard of the Adobe Edge Suite of products?
No, I've heard of a lot of Adobe products, but not that one.
Yeah, so Edge was sort of like an experimental suite of products that they came out with a number of years ago, like 2012 or so, I think. And there were three primary ones. One was Edge Reflow, and the idea behind Reflow was that you'd be able to sort of mock up or prototype responsive designs. It was very, very big on using responsive design to actually create prototypes for your application. One of the things that people didn't really like about it that much is that it was really only for prototyping. Like you could do stuff and output the code or copy the code and like integrate it into other things, but it wasn't really meant for that, which was a pretty big drawback. You had Edge Inspect, which allowed you to preview your responsive designs on mobile devices that were connected to Inspect. So Inspect would like run on your desktop, then you'd have a little mobile app and you could preview the design sort of as you work on them, so it was like real time, which was pretty cool. There's a lot of different tools that do that now. And probably the biggest one was Edge Animate, which gave you animation and interactive capabilities for the DOM. So this is still DOM manipulation. It's moving rectangles around the screen and so forth, but it had that interactive aspect. So you could create things that you could actually like click on and do stuff with. It had built-in abilities to do responsive design stuff, like the media queries and so forth. But as indicated by the quote up there, the Adobe Edge Suite is not a thing anymore, right? What they did do, though, is they were able to take a lot of the concepts and the feedback from these different pieces and integrate them into tools that they do have today that they continue to use, right? So Edge Reflow, a lot of the media query stuff went into Dreamweaver. Edge Inspect, a lot of that stuff actually went into things like Photoshop. So just being able to do kind of web layouts using visual tools in Photoshop and then previewing them on a connected device. And some of the stuff from Edge Animate went off into things like Dreamweaver or Adobe Muse, and even little pieces went into Flash Professional, which they rebranded to Animate CC, which is, I know, super confusing for a lot of people because Edge Animate and Animate CC, it's almost the same name, right? So talking about these different tools, you'll notice here's Dreamweaver CC 2017, and this version of Dreamweaver is actually created from scratch. So the old source code, the old application was sort of put to the side, and they decided a few years ago actually to rewrite the whole thing to be modern, to focus on things like media queries and responsive frameworks and things. And you can see up top there inside the view that we actually have the different media queries laid out, very similar to what we saw inside of the Chrome Dev Tools. You've also got Animate CC, which is something I spend a ton of time in. It's kind of the primary application that I do all of my authoring on. And there's a lot of different responsive utilities that are actually within Animate CC. And Animate CC, again, is sort of a rebranded, platform agnosticized Flash Professional. So it can do all this sort of animation stuff that Flash Pro used to do, but you can also do a bunch of interactivity when it comes to things like JavaScript, doing stuff for HTML5 Canvas or WebGL. It's very web-friendly now. And one of the things that makes it so web-friendly is that you've got a number of responsive options that, sadly, this projector doesn't really show. It's got the text all chunky there, but you've got the ability to make your different compositions, whether they're just animations or if they're actually, interactive elements, tools, and things. You can make them responsive, and you can set up how you want them to be responsive. It's a different kind of model. It's more, when we were talking about those 3 points, this is more the model of how flexible media interacts with responsive design. So you can create the stuff, include it within a larger grid, something built on Bootstrap or something like that, and then have it adapt itself to different things. And I've got a number of different examples of this that we'll look at with these live demos here. So the first thing I wanted to show for live demo, this is the portfolio, and this is my portfolio. What we can see here is that we've got some grids going on, right? So we've got a grid here, we've got a grid here, we've got a grid here, and they make columns for us. And what we've got going on is that we've actually got grids nested in grids, because here in sort of the main content area, you can actually specify like what sort of grids you want to have as part of your portfolio. And then that's like a grid, a set of columns and so forth inside there. But then you've got an additional grid around there that has the banner, and if you have a sidebar or navigation up top or whatever you choose, it'll apply that grid differently. So it's very flexible in terms of what Bootstrap can do. Let's actually right-click and choose Inspect here and have a look at some of the choices we have. So you can see that everything is adapting as I move stuff around. So if it's small enough, it all changes to a one-column layout. And one thing we don't do here is we don't actually hide a lot of stuff. There are a few things we will hide if you have a very small resolution device. So we'll hide a lot of the more complex like editing options if you're logged in. But in terms of presentation, we want anything that you put on the page to actually show up here. So instead of squishing all those columns into these unreadable columns, what we do is we stack the columns, right? And let's see here. What I want to show, though, is a couple of these options that Chrome comes with, and other browsers have similar options to this. But there's this device toolbar option that's really cool. Like I mentioned, you've got your different breakpoints, and you can actually click on these breakpoints to see how your design is going to look at those particular breakpoints. So it's really, really good tool to throw something out there and then just play with this and see how it works. Notice as well, you've got things like this where you can just kind of choose your own resolution, and you can see it changing up here. You can also, of course, tap in a specific pixel width and height and so forth. And you've got, aside from just responsive web, a number of profiles already set up. So let's say I wanted to see what this looks like on an iPhone 6. Then, okay, somebody looking at this site on an iPhone 6, that's what it would look like. And you've got all additional tools here. You can change it to a landscape view and so forth. And of course, there's other options. You can hide media queries if you want. You can hide the device frame, then it's not going to look like a device anymore. You can also, if you're doing some sort of documentation, you can capture a screenshot right from here, and then you don't have to rely on something like Snagit, which Snagit's great, but maybe you're just doing stuff in the browser, or you don't have that particular software or anything like that installed. But there's all sorts of tools here for that sort of stuff, and you can even edit and add your own device profiles. And as I mentioned, you can change any of this stuff here. So, like, let's just say I want to inspect my banner. And let's find where that is, portfolio banner. So I could go through here and I can see all the different CSS box model attributes in here. So I can see the margin, the border, the padding, and the actual size of the element itself. These things can all be changed. And you can see that we've got some media queries going on here even. If we wanted to tweak some of these, we could easily just go in here and edit that and just tweak the different particular media queries to see how things would look differently, right? And this is something that's just available in the browser. So it's, it's there already. Talking a bit about Dreamweaver. So this is Dreamweaver 2017. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. Go away. So if we choose new here, we've got a number of different document types. It has support for CSS preprocessors even, like less and Sass. I don't know if anybody uses those in this room, but it's there. But you've also got starter templates, and these starter templates have both responsive starters that are sort of like a generic type of responsive, and then if you want to use Bootstrap templates, they've actually got a whole bunch of Bootstrap templates here too that you can use. So maybe I'll do Bootstrap Portfolio, which of course is completely different from the university's portfolio system. It doesn't have any sort of, relation, right? But, you've got this nice dual view that you can use where you can see how things are going to render, and you've got all your code here. And one of the nice things about this new version of Dreamweaver is that you've actually got a lot of really good tools for writing code in here. So, a lot of people used to use Dreamweaver just for the WYSIWYG aspect of it. But you're really doing yourself a disservice if you do that, because the tooling is like so much better. And it's actually based on the open source Brackets program. So Brackets is a free editor that you can download. It's actually written using web standards, and it's focused on HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But that's just built in here, and it's got a whole bunch of extra stuff built onto it to integrate with Dreamweaver. But notice that you also have different media queries up here. Like you can see this one is max width 767 pixels. And just like with Chrome DevTools, you can always make adjustments to see how things would fit at different resolutions. In addition, I want to show some animate stuff. And the projection screen is forcing my screen to be very, very picky here. But just a little bit of explanation. I've got some code in here, but I've commented it all out. Because when Animate CC first came out, it didn't have any responsive stuff in it. So if you wanted to actually make things responsive, this is the sort of code you would have to write to do that. And most people don't want to deal with that. They don't want to have to do that. And no. And I even went so far as to record a bunch of videos and things and examples of how to go about kind of doing this stuff back when it first came out, when responsive stuff wasn't available. So you've got things like responsive scaling while respecting the aspect ratio of the composition, responsive scaling while ignoring the aspect ratio of the composition, and then responsive repositioning of elements. And this one right here, the responsive repositioning of elements, is something that I think is overlooked quite a bit. And it's not that difficult to figure out how to do this stuff. So here's an example of it. So I've got those 5 different Animate logos on the stage. And basically what we're doing here is we're just setting these things to sort of match whatever the stage canvas was embedded at. So if you go ahead and embed your composition to a certain width and height, and it renders at, say, like 100% or whatever, it's going to be able to read whatever the width and the height of that is. And then you can reposition instantly all of the different objects that you have there. And that's something people have been doing for years, even before responsive design became a thing, which I find really interesting. It's overlooked all the time, this sort of stuff. But back to Animate itself. Inside of here, if I wanted to actually make this responsive in some way, and so squished. So if we look inside our publish settings, we can see for JavaScript/HTML, we've got a number of different options here. We can center the stage, make responsive, and there's other options in there. So let's go ahead. You know what? Look at that. The screen isn't even big enough for me to hit OK there. Let's see if I can guess. This is rough. Okay, I got rid of it. Good. So if I do a Command Enter, so it shows this is the sort of default view for something like this without any sort of responsive stuff available at all. But then if I go back into my publish settings, we can do something like make responsive. And you can say you want to make it responsive on both the horizontal and vertical, or just width or just height. It depends on what you're doing, right? So if I say both here, and I don't know if I canceled or, all right, I canceled. So I gotta hit that twice. Oh, you know what'll work? Did it actually cancel? No, it didn't cancel. Okay. So if I go in here, what if I do 3, tab, tab, tab? You know, if we just go File, Publish, then I won't have to deal with it. I can just refresh. Let's refresh. All right. So you'll notice nothing looks like it happened, but actually if I resize this, then you see, oh, it is actually responsive. However, it doesn't get responsive up. So if you try to like scale something upwards, it's not happening. However, there's an option for that in here as well, and that is to scale to fill the visible area. And you can choose to fit in view or to stretch to fit. If you fit it in the view, it's going to still show everything, but it might have some like space on either side or on the top and the bottom or something like that. If you do stretch to fit, it's just going to stretch everything out to take up the entire space. So it depends on exactly what you're doing, of course, what you want, which particular choices you make. Let's go back to the browser and refresh. All right, so you can see here now it's actually scaling it up as well as down. So this is a good example of what we saw right at the beginning in terms of flexible media, right? Because things are actually being flexible. You can think about this thing actually inside of a column or as a banner, some kind of interactive banner, where you want it to be able to maybe just shift depending upon the width or maybe width and height, whatever you're dealing with, right? So those are just some examples, some demonstrations of different tools that are out there. You know, I pick the 3 that I'm probably most familiar with: Chrome DevTools, Dreamweaver, and Animate CC. But anyway, there's more stuff even than just that, right? So you can use responsive design beyond the web. One of the ways you can do that is through Apache Cordova. So does anyone know what Apache Cordova or PhoneGap are? This is basically like a platform you can use, a set of tools that allow you to write mobile applications and then sort of wrap them inside of a Cordova wrapper. And that is like a native application that runs on a device. So you write the code in HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and you can use all that responsive stuff. You can use Bootstrap 4 in there. You can use whatever you want. And you publish as an application that you can put on iOS, Android, and there's actually a bunch of others too. Cordova supports probably like 6 to 8 different platforms. And it's free and open source, so you can just use it. There's also PhoneGap, which is, it's based on the Cordova source code, and it's got some extra stuff with it, some extra hooks in the CLI. There's other tools around that. And PhoneGap is actually integrated into a number of different other tools. Actually, I think IBM as well has something that's based on Cordova. If you think about, there's a framework for writing mobile applications called Ionic, and Ionic is also based off of Cordova. There's a lot of different applications and frameworks like this that use Cordova as a base. There's also Apache Flex. So Apache Flex is mostly based right now on targeting applications to either Flash Player or Air. And when I say Air, that also includes writing, again, native applications for either Apple iOS or Google Android. And you can use all of the stuff that's inherent in MXML and Apache Flex on these other platforms as well to write stuff to run on devices. A lot of the code that I was showing inside of Animate in terms of doing stuff by hand being responsive, you can do in there certainly. But MXML and Flex by themselves were like way ahead of their time, like 10, 12 years ago, because you were able to do some really cool responsive stuff there where you could like pin certain sides of an object to certain other sides based on differences in width and height and percentage and things like that. And you could have your application screen adapt to any sort of screen, any sort of device, and it would do so. And it's still a superior model to what we have in the web world, which is bizarre since it's like 12 years old or whatever. But there's also, if you're not writing applications directly for iOS or Android, there's also Flex.js, which is sort of like a branch of Apache Flex that outputs to both like a Swift-based target and an HTML, JavaScript, CSS-based target. And that stuff you can, of course, integrate additional libraries into it, like Bootstrap or jQuery Mobile or whatever you want to do. Adobe Air I mentioned in the last slide, and you've got a number of options for that. You can use Apache Flex and its responsive nature to build stuff. You can use pure ActionScript, and there's also ANEs, which are native extensions that you can use with particular devices. So that's what I have, and there's a couple of notes about publications that I've got going on. There's the beginning Adobe Animate CC book that I wrote with a friend of mine, Tom Green, and that's coming out in March, most likely, end of March, early April. I've also got my last book, Learn Adobe Animate CC for Interactive Media. It's been out for almost a year when it comes to March of this year, and that is actually focused on like the ACA exams. So if you're looking to get certified in something, then that's a very laser focused on that. And I've got a number of other publications too. This is like a journal chapter on that I wrote with a few other people, my sister and so forth, on absinthe and marketing and things like that. So it's not, I don't just write about Animate and responsive design and things like that. And I've got a ton of stuff on lynda.com. I've got stuff on Pluralsight and a bunch of other places. I also want to mention that Adobe is having a creative jam at the Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design, and University of Denver students have been invited to participate in there, either as contributors to the actual creative jam itself, or just to show up and hang out and so forth. And there's an invite link there, nvite.co/rmcad, that you can go to find out more information about it. It's on Thursday, February 16th. So that's a neat local event that you might consider. And thank you. I've got my Twitter handle up there, my email, and my website.